Yay! What is up, everybody? Happy Monday. I'm realizing that my video is probably going to start blasting audio into your ear, so I'll pause that now. What is up, everyone? Happy Monday. Happy Ginger Runner Live, episode number 179. We're getting up there.
It's true.
Tonight's episode I'm excited about because I feel like the last few weeks here of summer, everyone's going to be like, it's not the end of summer because it's still hot and it's crazy, obviously. There have been a number of races, big top-tier races happening here towards the end of summer. Cascade Crest obviously just happened. And, we shared that experience last weekend. But Leadville, and then just this last weekend, UTMB, the Super Bowl, a little crazy. Our guest tonight, we're going to talk to him about a whole number of things because, one, he's just a fantastic ultra runner, fantastic athlete, an incredible coach who coaches some of the best athletes on the planet. But he did some pretty incredible things this summer by running Western States as well as winning Leadville, which is something I just found out just before the show that he's done every year that he's won Leadville or run Leadville, he's run Western States. It's like this incredible double that I didn't realize he had done. And it's just, you put two and two together, you go, oh yeah, that's very challenging, as well as coached a number of athletes that participated in this last weekend's UTMB. So we're going to talk to him all about training for Leadville, what it was like to win this year, his fourth victory at Leadville, the whole gap between states and Leadville and everything like that, and maybe even touch on some UTMB coverage because like a lot happened. So sit back, relax, everyone. Welcome to Ginger Runner Live. Our guest tonight, Ian Sharman. It's going to be a blast. Let's get started. Ginger Runner. Yeah, what's up, everyone? Happy Monday. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy Mondays to spend a little bit of it with us.
Holiday Monday.
Holiday Monday.
Some people. Most
yeah, for those maybe in the United States, maybe Canada.
Definitely Canada.
Definitely Canada. Labor Day. Happy Labor Day. And tonight's show, I'm excited about tonight's show because our guest he's a very important person in the sport of ultra running. He's made a name for himself not only by winning races and some of the most difficult races across the globe, but he's a coach and he coaches some of the best athletes out there. And I'm so excited to have Ian Sharman back on the show. He's been on the show before, but it was a long time ago. Maybe there's a trivia question in tonight's episode. What was the episode that Ian Sharman was on Ginger Runner Live previous? I'm sure it's not going to take someone very.
And was I sitting in a chair on the cooler in the other room or did I live in Canada still?
That's an even more valid question.
I wouldn't even know the answer.
Yeah, I wouldn't either. So before we get to Ian and introduce him, I just want to give a couple shout outs, of course, to Brian Sands, who is now in his third month of top tier sponsorship for Ginger Runner Live, helping it happen week after week. So Brian, thank you so much. For those of you who maybe this is your first time watching Ginger Runner Live, or maybe you're a Patreon supporter and you know Brian's name. Brian has continued to support us at the top tier, but he is a runner himself, and he's been a viewer of the show, participant. He's in the chat room tonight, of course, as he is every Monday, and he's training for his very first marathon coming up on October 8th, which is the same day as GRVR. Very exciting. But it's his first marathon, and he's been logging long miles, the longest distances he's ever run in his training leading up to this first marathon. So it's exciting to follow his story, and week after week we actually get to talk a little bit about it, which I think is great. And thank you, Brian, for continuing to help Ginger Runner Live happen. Maybe even tonight we can talk to Ian about maybe some advice that Ian would give someone maybe training for their first marathon or ultra marathon. It's a great opportunity to sit down and chat with our guest for such instances. Of course, I'm not the only one sitting here in front of the camera.
Hi, guys. I'm Kim. As always, I'll be in the chat room. So if you guys have questions for our guest tonight, please ask them there.
And I think we might even have some viewers tonight who participated in this weekend's big events over there in France, Switzerland, and Italy. I think I got the three countries right.
You're referring to as the big event?
UTMB.
Like when we had to talk about the Olympics and we're not allowed to talk about the Olympics.
Yes. Many years ago, we could not actually say the words Olympics. I'm probably going to get banned just for saying it there. In this case, UTMB, Ultra Trail de Mont Blanc, happened, and it's this huge spectacle of a race. Yeah. Someday I hope to maybe participate. It definitely takes some time to get into it, but some viewers tonight, if you participated in those events, or maybe you're watching the archive version of this, congratulations. I hope you got it done. I hope you finished it. If you did not, don't worry. I can imagine it was very tough because the conditions did not look ideal.
Yeah.
And I've only heard incredible stories. All right. let's get on with our guest, because our guest is very VIP. And without further ado, I'd like you guys to give our guest a wonderful Ginger Runner Live welcome. It is the one and only Mr. Ian Sharman.
Yay!
Thanks, guys. That was a great introduction. I feel like it's difficult to live up to that when you call me important.
Well, I mean, I'm looking right there on that counter behind you, and I think that's pretty awesome. So those are your three of four Leadville.
Yeah, the other one's bigger, so it doesn't fit on there. I'm glad that they made them smaller, because I fly there usually, and it's difficult carrying back about 30 pounds worth of wood and metal in hand luggage.
Crazy.
Yeah, that's one of the few things that I have out from running that really means something to me.
I mean, it's really neat to see them in person. And I remember the first time I saw my first cougar, the Western States Trophy, when I saw that in person. I love that you have them back there. How does this year's, let's just get right into it. How does this year's Leadville compare to the previous 3 victories? I mean, was there something that helped make this year stand out?
I think that the main thing was it's longer. So they added a couple of miles to it. So that always screws around with your head a bit. I think the people at UTMB deal with this every year, because they seem to always add on distance every single year.
Right.
But normally, I mean, they actually said they think it was a bit short before. So they think they were just making it like 100.5 miles. Difficult to know that, because the GPS isn't super accurate over that kind of distance. But that was the main thing. But the weather I've had for all 5 years I've been there has been pretty damn perfect, really. I've had kind of mild temperatures, maybe up to 70 degrees, not really getting rained on, not really getting too cold. So ideal running conditions. So I always hear about UTMB and Hard Rock, and they go through these epic storms and snow and ice and stuff. And I'm running in Leadville thinking, oh, this is just really nice. I'm in shorts and t-shirt the whole race, apart from maybe the first hour. So I think that the main thing for me was just I vomited, which I've only ever done once in a race before.
I remember reading that.
That made it harder for me. That my stomach didn't feel quite perfect the whole way, or at least in the second half. And then there's always the danger at altitude of having a load of things go wrong, that it just makes everything more difficult, eating, effort level, etc. Yeah. And most of the race is above 10,000 feet, and it goes up to 12,500 feet. So I put it down mainly to that just a little bit of bad luck, the altitude making it harder, and then maybe I had some slightly dodgy food about 2 or 3 days before that didn't help. But that was the one made it harder for me. But luckily for once, I wasn't kind of head to head against anyone right at the end. So I was able to just dial it back a little bit and just kind of go into survival mode rather than having to race super hard in the last 10 miles. But because of that, I think it could have been a hell of a lot harder if I'd have had someone right next to me. Sure. And I'd have probably had to be doing some kind of more like a beer mile type of thing, kind of run, vomit style finish to the race.
That does not sound ideal, nor does it sound fun. I want to point out for those viewers tonight that Ian Sharman, I want to talk a little bit about this double, but Ian, you've run Western States, is it 7 or 8 times now?
Last 8 years, yeah.
Last 8 years, and have finished top 10 every single year.
Yeah.
And
that's incredible in itself.
It's incredible in and of itself. We've talked about states on the show before. The top 10 get invited back. Both top 10 men and women get invited back each year. So you've essentially managed to get yourself invited back each year, because you placing top 10 at Western States is a huge feat because of the speed. And each year it seems to just get progressively faster. With your time spent at a race like this, how has it changed, and how have you been able to stay so consistent as the speed continues to increase at something like States?
Well, the first few years I did it, I kept getting quicker and ending up about the same position. So I felt like I was getting better runs the first kind of 4 or 5 and getting nowhere because everyone else was getting better as well. Then the last couple of years, it's been a bit slower. And even on paper, it was super competitive. In the end, it turned out to be more strategic, that you had to be the smart runner. I mean, Jim Walmsley went out super fast both years. And so it looked like there was going to be a ridiculously fast winning time. And in the end, there wasn't quite so much, especially this year in the heat and all the snow and the mud early on. So for me, I think I've learned how to make a bad race into a good race. And I think that's the reason that I keep getting the top 10, that I've never really had a really good race at Western States. I've managed that a couple of times at Leadville, but I've always turned what could have been a bad day, turned it round to be able to kind of get through the last 30, 40 miles in one piece without it falling apart. Sure. So maybe not as perfectly as I'd want, but avoiding, hemorrhaging hours and hours from things going really wrong. So I think that's the main skill that I've developed in recent years that allows me to avoid those really, really bad days. And I just want to have those awesome days. I want to go out there and have that perfect day with the most amazing time and everything feel great. But I also realize how rare that is in a 100-miler, that even the very best runners, it's not something they can do every single time. I mean, Killian's about the only exception to that rule, but he's kind of his own category. So you can't really say, well, we should all be like that, because it's not really possible. But I think it's so difficult to have that amazing day where, if Jim had finished last year and broken the course record by half an hour or something, it would have been one of those epic things. And it's not necessarily guaranteed that he could keep doing that again. And I think that's one thing people don't realize is so special about a 100-miler is when someone has that perfect day, it could be the only time in their life they have that in a 100-miler. They might replicate at shorter distances, but not always at the really long stuff. So I've done, I think, 18 or 19 100-milers, and I'd say I've had 2 really good ones. And I think that's pretty good odds. That's better than most people could say from 1900s. So, the other 17 weren't bad at all, but they were well off where I thought it could have been on that perfect day.
I love that you brought that up because, I guess I want to talk about pressure, not only self-inflicted, but maybe external, because I can imagine you returning to these races, States, Leadville, where you have performed incredibly well year after year. Do you feel pressure for yourself to do well each time you go back to these races?
I mean, I would say that it doesn't matter what race you're doing, 5K, 10K, marathon, whatever. If you're not nervous and you don't feel some pressure, self-imposed or otherwise, it doesn't mean much to you. I mean, if you're going there and you think, oh, it's just a breeze, I can do this in my sleep, you don't care that much. Because even if you could finish it in your sleep, like let's say it's a 5K and you could run it easy and finish, that's not really the challenge. The challenge is to do your very best race. And that's slightly nerve-wracking. So I definitely don't sleep a whole lot the night before.
Yeah.
The way I always think of a 100-mile, especially Leadville and Western States that I love, is that it's a really fun couple of weeks beforehand. And everyone's like, oh, I haven't seen you for a year and this is great. And we're playing on the trails. And then the day before, there's that gulp. I have to run 100 miles and I only get to enjoy it this way if I do it quite well. So there's definitely that last minute pressure. But the nice thing as well, I find, is that the early hours of 100-miler, you've got a few hours to kind of get into a rhythm. So you don't have to nail it in the first mile, unlike a shorter distance where you've kind of got to hit it pretty hard and get it exactly right. So because of that, I try to just take the pressure off and tell myself that there's kind of like a warm-up 20 miles where you're going at a more comfortable pace, you're talking to your friends, and you're enjoying the scenery, in particular Western States. That is the most scenic part of the course. You're in the mountains, you've got the sunrise over Lake Tahoe. So I try and make sure that I can enjoy the experience. And one of the things I told myself this year at Western States was that even though I've got a goal of doing at least 10 top 10s at Western States, really, I want to win it. I don't want to just turn up and feel like I could have done better. But I also want to look back at the 10 years and go, that was an awesome 10 years, not that was a stressful 10 years. And I didn't really like any of the races. So I really tried to remember that during the race. And then it was such horrible conditions. It became survival fairly early on. But I was still trying to get some enjoyment out of it, even when it got really bad, to try and say to myself, this is something people really, really want to do. They can spend 7-8 years trying to get into this race. And just because I've managed to get into it multiple times, it doesn't mean it's still not something I should hugely value. So I try and keep that perspective in it to both take the pressure off and to remind myself that ultimately I'm doing this because I like it. This isn't like I'm a professional NFL player earning millions, and even if I didn't like it, I want to earn millions, so I'll keep doing it. This is ultra running, and it's something we do because we love it.
How important is it for your athletes to, because I'm using Magda as a perfect example, one of your athletes who might have an off day, might have an injury kind of pop up, but continue to at least enjoy the experience. UTMB, a perfect example this weekend. How important is it for you and your athletes to also enjoy the experience despite maybe having a rough day?
I think it's essential. And it's one of the key philosophies behind the way that I coach people is just to kind of take some of the pressure off themselves. Tell them it's not life and death. The reason they're doing this ultimately is because it's something that inspires them, that they love. Magda's actually an awesome example of that because she's got so much experience. She's raced in the Diamond League. She's raced at the Olympics. So she can deal with pressure. But even still, I was chatting to her via email today, and she was saying how she was very close to dropping out from UTMB because she had a hip flexor problem from very early on that meant she couldn't really run downhill much and certainly couldn't compete with people. So she realized after about 2 or 3 hours, she was not going to be competitive. And that's pretty big thing to swallow when you're going there knowing that you're one of the favorites, and you know that you've got many, many hours ahead of you. They're going to be slower than you want, and it's not going to be as good as you originally wanted it to be. But Magda is able to turn anything around. I mean, she's got such an awesome outlook on racing and life in general. And I'm sure you've seen photos of her at Western States, like hugging Casey Lichtig at the top of the first climb. She had a similar kind of thing here where about 60 miles in, she started running with Casey and also with Amanda Basham. And they just kind of grounded out together, and that made it worthwhile. That made it a special experience for them. So she certainly got a lot out of the race, and she's extremely happy that she didn't give up. Plus, she had an additional thing that there's a track athlete, David Torrance, who died in unusual circumstances just a couple of days before the race, and she used to train with him and knew him very well. So that was weighing on her mind in a pretty big way as well. But these are the kind of things that any runner will have, you know, family emergencies right before a race, putting more pressure on themselves to get, for example, silver buckle at Western States, the big buckle, the sub-25 hour at Leadville. And they can sometimes think that that's the most important thing in the world. And they've got to be able to put it in perspective and say, no, you're trying to enjoy this as well. This is an epic race in itself, and it's not just about the outcome.
Oh, fantastic. We're going to take a couple of live questions. I've been feverishly watching Kim pull questions out of the chat room because tons are popping in here. So let's do that, and then we're going to talk to Ian about his States experience leading into Leadville this year.
Sure. Question from Nathaniel in the chat room. Question for Ian. How do you handle adversities during a race? How do you keep them from negatively impacting you?
I think the main thing is I always try and find a positive in anything. So it's almost like a self-help guru type of mentality of, okay, well, if this isn't going well, what is the positive in that? Like when I was feeling queasy and lightheaded and I puked at the top of one of the big climbs near the end of Leadville, I said to myself, okay, well, that's not great, but what are the good things that are going on right now? Firstly, once you get over the top of this, it's going to feel better afterwards. As soon as you start going down, that's easier in terms of altitude. Also, I was winning. That's pretty big positive to try and remember. And so I always just try and look on the bright side of it, really. And that can be a very difficult thing to do if you have to keep doing it every few minutes, because those little negative voices are creeping in and they're telling you you're sore, you're tired. Do you really care about this? Why are you doing this? Are you sure you don't want to stop? All of those voices, you just got to drown them out and say, no, there are many good reasons why I'm doing this. This is really important to me, and I'm going to give it my best effort because I know that at the end of it, I'm going to have to live with it for months and months afterwards if I've done anything other than giving it a huge amount of the best I could do out there. Otherwise, it's so easy in the moment to give up and then regret it for months afterwards. So that I remind myself of that. And I think I've got an article coming out in about a month's time in Ultra Running Magazine about the 10 main motivators I used at Western States this year.
Great.
And some of them were more obvious, like keeping a top 10 streak alive. That was very motivating. Some of the other things were I told my pacer that I had just been thinking about dropping, but I don't need to if I'm honest with myself. So if I tell him I want to drop out at the next aid station, he should just laugh at me and say, no, you just told me you don't need to, so you're not allowed to. So just little things like that to kind of keep myself going. And in that case, I use the pacer to keep me honest. In other ways, I try and do it, just to turn mental things around to stay positive. And I just don't let myself complain. So if I'm about to say something to my pacer like, oh, I hurt or I don't feel good, I bite my tongue and say, that doesn't help at all. That's just having a little pity party that goes nowhere.
I mean, this is funny because you're not the only person on the show to mention there are ways and tricks that you can kind of trick your mind into remaining positive. Mm-hmm. I remember almost every low from every race. I feel like they're inevitable at some point. You're going to feel some sort of negative mind thing of you're like you said, my feet hurt or my ankle or my knees or this next aid station. I'm going to like sit. I'm going to rethink this whole ultra running thing. Maybe I should just stop running altogether. Is it easier in hindsight to talk about feeding or to shutting down those thoughts, or do you also have trouble sometimes shutting them off?
I've had at least 3 of my Western States where I either planned to drop out at some point, or I bargained with myself that if I got through this, I didn't have to do another 100-miler for at least a year. So I even said at the end of Western States a couple of years ago, I met one of my sponsors, Bob from Drymax. He was taking photos, and I said to him, I'm not doing Leadville. I'm done for this season. And then 2 weeks later, I said, I'm going to go there still. So, but it's little bargaining things you do. It's just trying to convince yourself to keep moving. It's like run to that corner and then run around that, run to the next tree, and just keep doing it again and again. And the longer the race is, the harder that is, because you've got to keep doing that and stay positive for even longer. And something like UTMB, where people can be out there for 48 hours. I've never been out in a race for that long. And I can't imagine if I had to do that for a day plus of just saying to myself, stay positive, don't think the negative thoughts, and genuinely having to find good reasons to keep moving. But it helps a lot as well that every time you successfully do it, you can, in the next race, say, this will fade. This is just a few hours of this. It's not a big deal. Come on, tough it out. And then at the end, you can whinge about it and whatever. Do whatever you need to do, but you're getting to the finish line before you're allowed to do that.
Love it. I think it's great advice. Get a couple more questions here.
Yeah, so there's been a lot of people asking this in the chat room, so we might as well take care of it now.
Sure.
Hard Rock, is that something that is on the horizon for you?
I would love to do it, but I don't even have a qualifier because Western States and Leadville are not qualifiers. So I've been in the lottery 3 times. I've not been lucky yet. I don't want to do it while I'm doing the 10 Western States. So I don't really want to do it the next 2 years because they're just too close together. And I want to give both of them enough respect to give it my full effort. But I'm thinking, from about 2020 onwards. So I think out so many years in advance. I'm thinking like Spartathlon, early 2020s. I'm thinking about what I'm going to do at Comrades all through that decade. And I've got kind of some longer term goals, but Hard Rock is something where I'm kind of assuming it could take me a decade to get in. And realistically, I might be, well past my prime when it happens.
I don't know if that will ever happen, Ian. I feel like the last 8 years at States alone is testament to longevity and your ability to stay completely relevant and fast in this sport for a long time to come. And I definitely want to talk about your advice with longevity and stuff like that at some point during tonight's show. I wanted to talk a little bit about, so your lead up to States this year. Did you do anything different compared to years previous? Do you go into it with the same sort of training block, and that contributes to your consistency there? You knew about weather this year. You knew about the snowpack early on. So did anything alter your training going into this year's event?
I keep trying to learn from each of them. So I usually learn one thing and correct one mistake and then make a new one. So the last 3 years, the mistakes I made were 2015, I didn't do enough heat training because I moved from California, where it was really easy to do heat training, to Oregon just a couple of months before. Right. And so I was probably in the best shape of my life, but I hadn't done enough heat training. So I got just destroyed by the heat and went way slower than I should have, given how fit I was compared to other years. Last year, I came into it with an injury that had meant I hadn't really trained on trails for the several months beforehand. So after I tripped over 4 times in the first 20 miles and I had bloody knees and bloody elbows and everything, I had to just dial it back a bit. And I realized that my legs weren't as used to the trails. That was not so much of a mistake. That was not much I could do about having an injury. And this year, I think the one mistake I made was I did a relay race 3 weeks before. One of these ones that's like 200 miles and you do 3 legs in a team of 12. And I did 2 super hardcore downhill legs where I was going well below my 5. I hit, on Strava, it showed my 5K PR, for example, in one of the legs by 2 minutes. Because it's that much downhill. So wow. It was the kind of thing that just destroyed my legs and they didn't quite feel fresh by race day. So that one little mistake of racing that 3 weeks out cost me from feeling perfect this year. Because I did the heat training right. I corrected that. And I felt the rest of my training was great, but just a little bit tired going into it. And then ultimately the conditions were so hard. It was more about how well you deal with them anyway. And hence why pretty much all the times from the top runners were a little bit slower than normal. But I keep trying to learn. I find that because I spend all day talking about running and talking about preparing for races with the runners that I coach, it helps me to put that into practice, but it doesn't mean that I don't make mistakes. I just try and correct them as quickly as I can and avoid them being too detrimental in a race.
It's guys like you and it's guys like Jeff Browning that to me just they idealize the idea of patience. And I've talked about you on this show numerous times as being, man, look at Ian. Every year he's patient at States specifically because you're not in the top 10 for the first 30, 40 miles or so, but you are consistent throughout the entire race. And it's like, oh my God, Ian's just going exactly according to plan. Like I can put money on predictions with you because you're just so consistent with your patience. how important, now I want to make this question apply to those maybe who aren't necessarily elites, but how important is patience to front of the packers as well as mid and back of the packers? Is it something that you try to train in to your athletes, or is it something
I just try and reiterate how important it is not to go out too fast. I mean, because obviously if you're doing 100 miles, at mile 2, you can speed up and it'll feel easy because you could go at 5K pace, but only for 5K, not for another 98 miles. So it's to remember just how easy it should feel to make it that sustainable. I would actually say, and I think, when I speak to Jeff, who lives about a quarter of a mile from me, we wouldn't maybe describe it as patience. We just describe it as pacing, that we're allowing for what is sustainable for the whole way, rather than, could I go quicker now? Well, of course I could. I'm fresh. So it's kind of thing like that. There's definitely discipline in there to not get carried away. And if someone goes past you, or you're further back than you want to be, or you hear a split and you realize that such and such is now X minutes ahead of you. I mean, last year at Leadville, I was pretty much on course record splits for 40 miles, but I was still 25 minutes behind Max King. So I was saying to myself, okay, well, I think what I'm doing is good 100-mile pace for me. If he can keep going at that pace, he wins ultimately. But there's 60 miles left, so we'll see how it plays out. And in the end, I caught him with about 20 miles to go. But it's about having a discipline to say, I'm doing my race, not someone else's race. And if I try and keep up with the likes of a Max or a Jim or a Rob Kra or a Killian, they just got a bigger engine than me. So in a short race, they're going to destroy me. In fact, I've raced Max probably 40 times because he also lives in Bend here. So if I can see him after the first mile, I'm usually doing well in a race. So it's only in 100 miles that it evens out at all. But when I put it in that kind of context, is that, of course, they can go a lot quicker than me for a long period of time. But there's all these other things that come into it that aren't just fitness when it's 100 miles. So I try and remind myself that if I can get all of that and do it really well and do it better than them, then in theory, you can kind of beat anyone, really.
I love the, I'm changing my word, because patience certainly implies that at some point you turn a dial on. Discipline is a better word. So from here on out, I'm going to say that Ian is a perfect example of discipline. And I like that word a lot better, because that at least implies that you know exactly what you're doing for the entire duration, as opposed to, okay, now I'm done being patient, let's turn on a switch. Because I don't think, based on your description,
you don't typically speed up. You just try to avoid slowing down. And that's a very different thing.
So now the time period between States this year and Leadville this year, what are you doing? So are you going out there and like getting your legs warmed up? Are you doing any sort of long distances, or is it just about staying healthy so you can toe that line?
Well, staying healthy is the first thing. So if there's any kind of injury coming out of Western States, that would be priority number one. What I tend to do is drink too much beer because it's awesome weather in Bend and it's a beer town. So after about 3 weeks after Western States, I start thinking, wait a minute, I've put on almost 10 pounds and I only have 5 weeks till Leadville. So it's you got to enjoy, celebrate after the first race. And that's also helping to not run. And like, for example, it's 2 weeks since I ran Leadville. I've done one run, and that was yesterday. And it was super easy, 6 or 7 miles. So I try to focus on recovery first. A lot of walking around. So I'll often walk 10 miles a day, but I just won't run. And I will purposefully hold back even if I feel like I could run. And then I start doing a lot of hiking in the mountains. So if I was training for UTMB, which I will do at some point, I would have exactly the same tactic, which is just go and play in the mountains, basically. Go and hike up mountains, jog back down, try and get as much vertical per week, but nothing super intense typically, maybe just kind of one speed session a week. And that's the perfect timing here, because we can't get into the mountains until after Western States because of the snow. And in fact, it was more like the end of July before we could really get deep into the mountains because it was so much snow this year. And then it actually worked out pretty well for me, because we were talking about this before we went on air, that there's a lot of smoke in the West Coast at the moment. And I drove out to Leadville 2 weeks before the race, and that was pretty much when all the fires started. So there was such hazardous smoke in town that I couldn't have gone up in the mountains there anyway. So it's really good that instead I was going up the San Juans and the mountains around Leadville itself. So I just tend to do a lot of hiking. So it's about 2 months between those races. I've got more of a focus on the amount of vertical I get per week. But even still, if you compare me to some of the guys you'll see training for UTMB, I think I saw several of the top American guys right before UTMB in the month of July did about twice as much vertical as I did. It was a huge amount they were doing. So I felt like I was doing a lot, 15 to 20,000 feet per week, but they were averaging way, way above that. which I just can't do. I just get exhausted, so I don't think it'd be very beneficial. But I try to make sure that I do stuff that's going to be specific to the race and that doesn't tire me out, because you're going to do worse if you try and train too hard and not allow for enough recovery between the two. And 8 weeks is still a relatively short amount of time between 200-mile races.
It is. I mean, I can't imagine the recovery. Has your body just adapted to that sort of transition at this point, where you can run 100 in 8 weeks? You can usually kind of
it's got better. Yeah, I'd say the first year that I did it, it probably took first 100-miler I did probably 6 months for me to feel perfect again. That didn't mean that I didn't race in that. I just keep feeling a little bit off and felt like I wasn't recovering like I should. Now I feel like within a month I can train as hard as I want again. And that doesn't seem to cause too much of a problem. Actually, I've typically done things like last year after Leadville, I did a half marathon 2 weeks later that went pretty well, and then a 10K the week after that where I got my 10K PR. So despite doing almost no speed work through the summer, I just about eked out a PR 3 weeks after it. So it shows that it is possible to recover well, as long as you don't try and do too much too soon.
Right.
So I'm not hitting it hard immediately. I'm giving it lots of time to walk around, have some beer. So it's not just physical recovery, it's also just giving yourself a break, and relaxing a little bit, chilling out, having some fun with friends, and enjoying the success of completing these types of things.
Awesome. We have tons of live questions, so go for it, Kim.
Yeah, a question from Juan in the chat room. Do you think that there are any advantages to running a second 100-mile race that close to the first?
I tend to feel fitter at Leadville than at Western States every year, but I put that down more to the fact that I can go in the mountains. So it's way easier for me to get in loads of vertical if I just have to drive out half an hour and then go up a beautiful mountain, rather than do repeats on a 500-foot hill or on a treadmill. So it's difficult to say which of those is more important, but I always feel like there's a little bit of a training benefit from doing the first one, as long as there's enough of a gap between them. But realistically, it's probably just the fact that I can do much more specific training for Leadville.
Awesome. Let's get to another one.
Yeah, a question from Kim in the chat room. For Ian, how do you condition yourself to spend so little time at aid stations? Kim went on to say maybe only 10 minutes or so at Leadville.
This is Kim Wrinkle, who I know you know.
Oh, yes. Yeah, I stayed with Kim in Silverton before the race. So, yeah, I'd say it's probably only about 10 minutes in total across the whole race. The aid stations are quite far apart. But firstly, having a good crew, so they know what you want, and you just kind of grab stuff from them and then go. I spend longer at Western States because I have to get ice. So the aid stations are close together. When it's super hot, I have to spend 2 minutes in there getting cold water poured on my head and getting ice put in my bandana and kind of just cooling down a little bit, especially after Devil's Thumb, one of the hottest parts of the race, and you just had this nasty, super steep climb. But ultimately, I'm just trying not to waste any time. So I just grab the food and the drink I need and then get walking. And I might walk for 100 meters while I take on some of that food. I think every single aid station at Leadville, I took a banana with me. And then one of them, I was just running along with this squidgy banana. I'd taken it out of the skin for 5 miles, just because it was so much, it's so hard to eat. And I'm like, I've got to eat this. It's getting gradually squished more and more and more.
That's gross.
And yeah, but everything's gross by that point, both in terms of eating and just you were pretty gross 70 miles into a race. So yeah, it's just that kind of thing that I try to keep the momentum going. And one thing that I found really helps, and this isn't so much relevant for point-to-point races, but for looped courses, is don't aim to do much at the start-finish area. So a Rocky Raccoon, a Javelina type of race where there's a big party, there's loads of people at that start-finish. There's also the temptation to stop because you're right next to your car and it's really convenient. And do you really want to go out and do another loop? So I always tell myself, if I need to get stuff done, do it in the aid station before or after the start-finish. And I literally sometimes don't even break stride going through that aid station. I'll just have my crew there. I'll grab bottles from them and just keep running so that it's not even a temptation to stop. Because again, it's difficult not to have the occasional thought in these races of, do I really want to keep going? This is getting tough. Why do I do this? So by not even giving that opportunity in a looped race, it tends to just make it all go a lot better and take away the negative thoughts you can have of, once I get there in 10 miles, then I'm allowed to stop. If you know you're just going to run through it, you don't even really have that temptation in the same way.
Raul in the chat room is using the hashtag hot banana, which is terribly disgusting. Let's get to one more question here because I know we have a ton.
I was going to say that Ian talking about the banana he was carrying, took me back to your 100-mile race where you carried around string cheese for hours and hours and hours.
I don't know what, like at the time I grabbed it, I was like, I am going to want this string cheese. I know I'm going to want it. And I think I unwrapped it. It was loose string cheese.
It was like dirty.
By the end, I never took it out of my bag for fear that there would be a mile I'd want it. So by the end, I had I think it was a 70-mile string cheese.
Yeah.
And it was so gross.
I also did that actually with M&Ms, where I took a handful of them, like ate 2 of them. And then I just had a multicolored hand because I held it for like 20 minutes before I got through them. And then it's just sticky and dirty and stuff. But I'd rather do that and then just squirt some water on it, clean it, keep moving, than stand at the aid station a couple of minutes and eat it all. Because I don't need to do that. I can keep moving and get the food in.
So I want to talk a little bit about Leadville. Obviously, this is a big race. It's a big deal. What is the draw for you to this race? I've never actually been witness to Leadville, but I know that it's a well-populated race. There's a lot of people that run it, but it has a draw. And you've gone back for 5 years now, won 4 of them. What's the draw for you?
I think the main thing for me was I'd read about it in books. So I'd read about it in particularly what was the Barefoot Runner one? I forget the name of it now. You know, the one with Chris McDougall, that one, and Scott Jurek. That's the one, yeah. So they talk about it in there, and Ann Trayson's races in the past there. Also, it's just part of the Grand Slam. And for some reason, after I did 3 Western States, I decided I wanted to do the Grand Slam. So that's doing Western States, then 3 weeks later Vermont, then 4 weeks later Leadville, then 3 weeks later Wasatch Front, and then the combined time for all of that. So I did that in 2013 just because I'd heard of it and I wanted a new challenge and to make it more interesting at Western States. And then I just really liked Leadville because it gave me an excuse, because with the altitude, I kind of had to go out there a couple of weeks in advance. Otherwise, living at sea level as I was at the time, or even in Bend, I'm only at 3,500 feet. So it's as good as sea level. So because of that, I felt like I had to be in Colorado. Then I'd never really spent any time there. So it was just fun being in the mountains and different mountains to where I live currently. And that kind of got me addicted. So it's not so much just the one-day element of it. It's the whole trip that makes it fun for me. And I think that's one of the things people find with Western States and Hard Rock and UTMB. They're big, epic races, but it's more the community you get in and around it and what you can do out there before and after, rather than just the 24 or 48 or whatever, however many hours it takes you to do the actual run. So yeah, I just kind of fell in love with it. And I definitely like the fact that since I won the first time, that made me want to go back. And now I kind of like streaking, as you can see with the consecutive Western States. I'm going to probably streak a little bit more with Leadville as well and see if I can get, I think 5 wins is the most anyone's ever had. So if I can get 2 more, then that would be kind of nice just to have the most ever. But definitely can't take that for granted. And ultimately, it largely depends on how competitive the race is, given it's so close to UTMB. Right. And can I nail it when I'm there? And you know, I had a worse race this year, but luckily it wasn't as fast as it could have been. So for the other runners, so I got away with it. But you know, if someone like Rob Krah, who was meant to be there, had turned up, I'm pretty sure I'd have been second with that time.
Now, I know that you've talked about that this year's race is the first time that you've puked in a race environment. Would you say that was the lowest point for you mentally as well? I mean, was that something that you're like, oh my God, what is going on? Or were you questioning your ability to win at that point? Or
it wasn't actually that bad. I mean, it was more that beforehand I was feeling dizzy. So I was doing a climb that I'd done typically every year. It's been a really strong part of the race for me. You're about mile 76, a couple of miles of road, then you do the climb up power line and you go up to 11,000 feet. And usually I've been really good on that, like averaging a walk run the whole way and feeling like I'm catching people or putting time on people. This year I was just walking up it, feeling lightheaded, tripping over stuff. So that was the worst part. But when it came up, I felt fine. It's like, oh, I'm a lot better now, but I've got to be careful because there's still 20 miles left. But that wasn't actually the biggest low point. I didn't have huge mental low points. And ultimately, when you're in the lead, it feels a hell of a lot more positive. So that really helps to keep me focused anyway. But I've had it happen once before at Wasatch when I did the Grand Slam. So in that race, it was a combination of it being 100 degrees, as well as it having altitude and it being the hardest 100-mile course I've ever done, and the end of a huge summer, and just giving it everything, going head-to-head with Nick Clark, who was ahead of me in that race. And so I had to stay within about an hour of him, and I was like 30 minutes behind at halfway. So there's a lot of panic, and I think that probably added to the stress. But I actually just found that, because I talk to people all the time about stomach issues, it's okay, well, how do you solve this problem? Rather than, oh no, woe is me, or my race is screwed now. It was, what do we need to do to fix this? How are we going to get this back on track? Maybe not perfectly, but to be able to get to the end of the race feeling good. And I luckily didn't have to destroy myself in the last kind of 15 miles or so, because I knew that I had about a 1 hour lead. Right. But also in the final miles, I was telling myself, I'm just going to take it easier, because I want to cross the finish line and be able to like have my arms in the air and feel good, rather than cross it and then immediately puke on someone's foot, which just isn't ideal.
Yeah, not ideal. He won. Blah.
Yeah.
One thing I feel like I can take away from you, Ian, is just like mental strength, and I feel like this is also maybe the coach in you that's tonight is being able to talk to us about these things. It's like I just get this real strong mental side to your ultra running, where you are able to manipulate your brain to kind of turn off those negative thoughts, and you're able to. I'm sure there's times when you struggle with this, like every other ultra runner. You've talked a bit about it tonight, but just being able to identify a low point and get on top of it. Do you coach this to your athletes? I'm using UTMB as an example here. Magda, a perfect example, had a pretty rough day out there. Is it something where you coach how to get through these mental lows? Is it something that you also learn from your athletes?
Oh, very much so, yeah. I mean, I've coached hundreds of people over the last few years. And so all these different experiences of how, the variety of problems people can have, what has caused it to be an issue for them. So learning what different personality types, what's going to affect them more, how they got over it, and therefore how I could help someone else who maybe doesn't think like me, but thinks in a different way to still overcome it. But a lot of it comes down, I'd say, it's not so much just mental strength. It's kind of just being able to put things in context and just not get fazed by things going wrong. So one thing I try and tell people is the morning of a race, particularly 100 miler, but to some degree shorter ultras as well, tell yourself that this could be the hardest day of your life. So the more you're prepared that it could be that bad, anything better than that is a positive. So if you're expecting there to be absolute hell out there at some point, when you're cruising along and you're feeling okay, it's like, wow, yeah, bonus miles. This is easy to do this. And then if it gets a little bit bad, instead of thinking, oh, this is worse than it was 5 minutes ago, you're thinking, well, this isn't as bad as I thought it could get, so I can deal with this. And then when the real, the shit hits the fan, that's the point where you can say to yourself, now this is the bit that matters. Is it going to be a good race today or a bad race today? And this is something that I'm prepared for and that I knew was going to happen. And now I'm going to be able to deal with that, because I'm psyched up for this hard part and know that this is what will give the race value. So I really try and get that across to people. It's not about being pessimistic. It's about kind of being realistic and just saying that you're willing to do whatever it takes, within reason. If your bone is sticking out of your leg, stop the race. That's not a good idea. But if it's just the kind of thing where in your heart of hearts, a week later, you'll look back at it and say, I didn't have to stop then, I just wimped out, then find a way to do it. And that's going to be so much more meaningful to you than stopping. And I get quite a few people who come to me who've maybe had a string of DNFs, and they're trying to work out how they can get to that finish line. And it's not that they're not fit enough. They're often actually very good runners, but there's just things that are stopping them. And so trying to get them past all of that and to be able to cope with the negatives.
I love it. I don't know if you can hear that, but our dog literally started snoring, probably the loudest he's ever snored right there. So I'm sorry if you heard that. That wasn't anything other than snoring from our dog. But I loved that. I thought that was great. And even the chat room is talking about how that's just incredibly positive. Tony's saying, I just love this positivity. And I couldn't agree. I think it's a great way to kind of look at things in a bit different light. I want to get to one more audience question before we move into the post show, because we also do post shows with our guests. And tonight, I feel like tonight's post show is going to be fantastic, because we still have a lot of residual questions from the main show. Plus those on Patreon, I'm sure we'll have a number of additional questions to ask Ian. But before we do that, I forget if we've done this with Ian, because the episode that he was on previous was 52. So it's been over 120 episodes since Ian's been on this show, which is almost 2 years. I'm sorry, 53, episode 53. I had to actually pull it up because I had completely forgotten. I don't know if anyone in the chat room actually got that question right.
I don't think anybody did.
I thought it was about 50.
Yeah, it was right. It was right around 50. So you're you're right there. So episode number 53 is when we had Ian on. But Ian, I don't remember if we ever did the quickie question quiz with you. It's just a rapid fire series of very simple questions. If we did, I kind of want to do it with Ian again because I feel like the answers maybe have changed a little bit, but it's also because it's been so long that this is it's a very fun thing that we like to do with our guests. Well, fun, very easy, and it's a great way to kind of see what is on their brain. Okay, so Ian, so basically how this works, we have a rapid fire series of questions. Answer with the first thing that comes to your head. You just give me the thumbs up whenever you're ready to go, and we'll just start ripping through them. Okay, what was your very first race?
I think it was a marathon. No, it was a half marathon. Reading half marathon outside of London in 2005.
Favorite running movie?
I kind of like the two ones about Prefontaine. They're the first ones that spring to mind, but I think there's a few other ones probably as well.
I know that you do both. Do you prefer trails or road?
I can't really answer. If I do only one of them, I really miss the other one. So I suppose I prefer trails, but I couldn't live without both types of racing.
Favorite place to run currently?
I'd say Bend. I mean, I've got, especially because we've only got about 3 months a year we can get in the mountains, and this year that was narrowed down to 1 month because of the smoke. So the mountains here are just absolutely beautiful in the Cascades. Love it.
Bucket list race?
Probably UTMB and Hard Rock. Those two. I know I will do them one day.
Mm-hmm. Guilty pleasure TV show?
I'm trying to think. I watch so many TV, pretty much every show that is like popular. I watch so much Netflix because I work from home, and so yeah, probably half of them are very pathetic and shouldn't be watched by a man of my age.
That's awesome. Favorite pre-race meal?
I tend to like kind of standard pasta type of meal, but not the night before, so it has to be sooner than that.
Favorite post-race indulgence?
Beer, definitely. I try and avoid it for a couple of weeks before the race, and then usually for about 2 days after the race because I don't want anything at that point. But then I really, really want to just relax, and I know I've earned it. Yeah.
And finally, your current running kicks. I'm actually curious about this too. Which ultras?
So for most of the stuff I'm doing, if it's on road, it's always the Escalante at the moment. I love that shoe. It's just so comfortable and flexible. So I've done all my races this year in it. For the trails, it's always the Lone Peak. I just love that shoe. So I use probably about 10 different models all the time, but for racing, that's the two.
Nice. And that's it. You passed.
Yay.
That's it. Very, very easy. I'm going to dovetail in one last question. I use that word all the time on the show, Ian. People love it because it's a drinking game. Anytime I say dovetail, apparently the audience drinks. In this case, this is something I'm really curious about. It doesn't matter if the race is extremely hot or if it's extremely cold, but I see the buff, and you always have some sort of head wrap or something around the neck. Is that to keep, like, is it stacked with ice or cold water during the hot stuff and for warmth otherwise?
So I usually have arm sleeves and a buff, a neck buff as well, because on a hot day, you can put ice in it and you can keep it wet and it keeps you cooler. And it's also mainly just, I'm running in the sun so much. It's unlike Western States, it's so sunny the whole time. I'm trying to avoid getting skin cancer, basically. So I'm trying to cover more of my skin. But also with the arm sleeves, if it's a hot day, you put ice in it, you keep them wet, and it keeps you cool. If it's a cold day, they keep you warm. So they work from both angles, really. That in the cold, the buff around the neck will keep you warmer, and in the heat, you can put the ice and water there. So they're kind of like a heating and a cooling system all in one.
It's one thing I've noticed in every race photo, like especially the hot weather things. I'm like, oh my God, Ian is wearing, because you usually have it loaded with ice or something like that, and I can't tell a lot of the time. I'm like, is he wearing a scarf? Like, what is going on? Like,
Ian, it's so
with,
like
hot.
M&Ms.
It's just filled with M&Ms and banana.
It's mainly gooey banana in there, just so I don't have to carry it in my hand. Yeah.
It makes it so much easier to just like pull it up and nibble.
That is my cooling tip for Western States. Fill it with squishy banana. It draws the heat away.
Frozen bananas. Maybe that's not a bad idea.
Work. I'm not sure I'd want to eat it afterwards, though.
You're right. No, it'd be the worst. It could be the best and worst idea ever. What a fantastic show. Ian, thank you so much for taking the evening to spend it with us. We're going to keep Ian around for our post show. For those of you who are unfamiliar how that works, basically, we like to do a show for our Patreon supporters just after this main show, literally seconds after, where we can just rapid fire with the questions that were asked by the audience, but not during the live show of our guest. And if you'd like to join us for that post show, it's very easy. Just go to patreon.com/thegingerrunner for as little as $1 a month. The fraction of a cup of coffee, you not only support what we are doing here, but you also get to interact with our guests week after week after week. So there's various levels, different perks. You can do it for a month and quit, doesn't matter. So we'll see you in the post show. We're going to have Ian here. I want to make an announcement also that the tour for Where Dreams Go to Die, which is the documentary where I followed Gary Robbins for 2 years at the Barkley Marathons. Both Gary and I are touring to 13 different destinations in Canada and the US. Unfortunately, we were very limited on time, so we had to pick a certain number of cities. I've already gotten some messages like, why aren't you coming to Chicago or X city? We would love to come to all of them, but if you would like to see the 13 cities that fit into the schedule, you can go to wheredreamsgotodie.com and you can get tickets to those venues, and a portion of the proceeds will actually go to benefit Frozen Head State Park, which I think is awesome. So please, if you are in or near any of those cities, we would love to see you, and it's going to be a great opportunity to actually sit down with Gary and hear Gary's stories firsthand, as well as see the movie. Ask Gary questions. Touch his luscious, glorious beard. Maybe he'll even give hairs away. Oh, that's so gross. Even go there.
Put that one too much.
I love Ian's reaction. Oh, that's so weird. Yes, that was very weird. I'm so disappointed in my own voice. And then finally, thank you to Brian Sands again for sponsoring Ginger Runner Live through the month of, oh my gosh, we're at September now.
It is September.
It's crazy. Cool. So that's it, everyone. Thank Ian Sharman very much. Ian, where can people find you? I want to make sure that we plug your coaching services, your social media accounts, and everything like that.
SharmanUltra.com is the coaching website, and all my social media is Sharman Ian, so Sharmanian.
Please go show him some love. You guys know what to do. And we'll be joining Ian here in the post show in just a couple of seconds for those Patreon supporters. If you're on Patreon, just go. It's already listed. And we'll see you guys in a couple of seconds. Am I forgetting anything? I always do.
I don't think so. Oh, I did want to say I've already been getting a few emails about when GRVR packets are going out. The process has started.
Our house is
a disaster.
Full. It's full of T-shirts, medals, stickers, patches, buttons, like everything. Yeah. So all of the packets for GRVR will be going out within the next, I think, 14 days, essentially. But international orders will go first in case they have to sit in customs, which unfortunately we don't have any control over. So international first, and then domestic. Very excited for you guys to get this stuff because it's dynamite. I'm really, really proud and happy with all of the gear this year. Yeah. Great. Thank you for reminding me on that. Yes. That's it, everyone. Get out there, train hard, race harder, and party the hardest. I know I am. We'll see you guys next week for another Ginger Runner Live episode. I hope to get some UTMB athletes on next week's episode. Yeah. Maybe I'm not even going to say.
Maybe we'll see.
Maybe we'll see. So thanks, everyone. Really appreciate the support. We'll see you guys next week. Okay. Bye.
Ginger Runner.